I cannot be silent.
Back when Eisenhower was the president, golf courses is where most of his time was spent. So I never really listened to what the president said, because in general I believed that the general was politically dead. But he always seemed to know when the muscles were about to be flexed, because I remember him saying something, mumbling something about a military-industrial complex.
As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our home nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problem, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent.
Each one reach one, each one time.
I cannot be silent.
Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Everyone must play a part. Everyone's got to go to work. Work for peace. Spirit say work.
I cannot be silent.
Empowering the body, mind, and spirit. This is We Cannot Be Silent with Phil Restino and Larry Pinkney.
Hello, everybody. My name is Phil Restino. I'm one of the co-hosts of the program We Cannot Be Silent, and our other co-host is Larry Pinkney. Larry, are you there?
Hello, everybody. I am definitely here.
Oh, good. And we have a special guest tonight from Canada, Joshua Blakeney. And he's a journalist, an activist, and it's with sad news that we reached out to Joshua. Actually, it was Joshua who reached out to the community first with his announcement that well-known, well-respected activist John Splitting the Sky Boncore passed away last week, and it truly is a terrible loss to us all. I would like to read from Joshua's announcement. It says, I am distressed to announce that my friend and comrade, Mohawk activist Splitting the Sky, has died. He participated in the Attica prison rebellion of 1971. John Lennon dedicated his famous song, Imagine, to him. He was in the American Indian movement. He attempted a citizen's arrest on George W. Bush. He was a dedicated 9/11 truther, and much more. Some call him the Che Guevara of North America. He will be sorely missed. Condolences to his loved ones, including Sandra Bruder. And so that's how we came to reach out to Joshua to join us on the program tonight. But Joshua, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks for that great introduction.
Oh, you bet. If you don't mind, I'd like to read the biography we have for you off of the Veterans Today website. Would you mind?
Certainly, no problem.
Okay. This is for the listeners. Joshua Blakeney is a freelance journalist and activist originally from Surrey, UK, living in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Joshua was the media coordinator of Globalization Studies at the University of Lethbridge from September 2009 to October 2010. Joshua earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology from the University of Lethbridge, graduating with distinction in April 2010. He is currently studying for a Master of Arts degree at the University of Lethbridge. His research topic is the origins of the global war on terror, academic debates and interpretive controversies. Joshua's research became national news after he was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Graduate Scholarship to study the origins of the global war on terror. Joshua has published articles on a variety of topics, including the war on terror, 9/11 and 7/7, Marxism, Anglo-American politics, Israel-Palestine, Zionism, with a number of media venues including globalresearch.ca, voltairenet.org, coldtype.net, the Canadian Dimension, the Canadian Charger, Veterans Today, Montreal 9/11 Truth, 9/11 Blogger, SPHR.org, and the Information Clearinghouse. His work has been quoted in articles in the National Post and on rabble.ca. Wow, boy, that's one busy guy, and your focus, Joshua, on the origins of the global war on terror, I think is wonderful. We've got to get to the root of it and deal with it to end it. I would like to introduce you, Joshua, and ask you to tell us whatever you'd like to tell us. Maybe a little more about yourself or whatever's on your mind. So we'll pass it off to you right now.
Well, sure. Well, thanks for the introduction. That biography is a little bit dated now. I'm actually primarily working as Press TV's Canadian correspondent now. I'm sure much of your listenership will be aware of Press TV, which is the Iranian language or the Iranian English language news service, which tends to address many of the topics which are omitted and censored from the mainstream media in North America. But the reason I actually embarked upon graduate studies seeking to deconstruct the origins of the global war on terror, which is a euphemism for 9/11, basically, to get into 9/11 in academic work, was actually because of Splitting the Sky, John Boncore, who was a close friend of my mentor and professor at the University of Lethbridge, Professor Anthony Hall, who before he founded the Globalization Studies unit at that institution, he had been an expert on Aboriginal affairs and Crown Aboriginal relations in Canada, and as a result, he had encountered Splitting the Sky in the 1990s, when Splitting the Sky was involved in what was effectively a modern-day Indian war, where a group of Aboriginals in Canada's westernmost province of British Columbia took up arms effectively against the state over a land dispute, and the Canadian military was sent in, and they used effectively landmines and shot rounds at these Aboriginal peoples. So Professor Hall had come to know Splitting the Sky. The graduate student used to come to my classes and talk to my university classes. And Splitting the Sky was someone whose life was comparable, analogous to that of Malcolm X, really. Splitting the Sky's father died. He was a working class man. He died when he was sent in to spray down some building, and he didn't have the necessary protective gear, so his father passed away at a young age. He was snatched from his mother by institutions, so he was institutionalized as a young age, encountered the the priesthood, the Catholic priests who are known for skullduggery vis-a-vis young boys, Aboriginal boys in particular. His institutionalization then led him to be in prison as a young man. He was sleeping on the streets, and he went into a mum and pop store to steal a sandwich, and stealing this sandwich or attempting to steal the sandwich, he found himself in Attica prison at the age of 19, just in time for George Jackson to pass away, the famous African-American activist who was killed in prison in August of 1971. And that stimulated the Attica State Prison Uprising, this historic prison takeover. And Splitting the Sky, I gather, was one of the leading protagonists in that prison uprising, where the prisoners were taking up the call of George Jackson and his colleagues for better conditions in the prisons and for a more just and egalitarian society. And I think many people identified with them. They related them in many ways to the Viet Cong, who were being oppressed in a similar way. Indeed, when Rockefeller, who I believe it was Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York, it was his responsibility to crush this prison uprising in Attica. I gather they used some of the chemical weapons, tear gas style chemical weapons, to suppress the prison uprising that were actually banned for usage in Vietnam, or were being used in Vietnam covertly. And so a lot of people, I think, in America in that epoch drew comparisons between the oppressed in the prison system in North America and the oppressed in Indochina, who were being massacred en masse by the same ruling class that were dominating the people domestically in the United States. And so Splitting the Sky, this was his first big moment. He found himself in Attica. A prison guard did die, William Quinn, and Splitting the Sky was scapegoated for that death. So then he found himself for another half decade inside the belly of the beast, with the stigma of being a cop killer. And he used to talk about how these, what he called the KKK connected prison guards used to come in and stage suicides, put sheets around his neck and pretend they were going to kill him, and then at the last minute they would detract their decision to kill him. And that was what was happening there. His conditions living in there as a cop killer, he found himself in solitary confinement, often in very austere and brutal conditions inside the prison. But it's one of those experiences that either makes you or breaks you. And in the case of Splitting the Sky, it was clearly the former rather than the latter. It made him. And he came out with all guns blazing. Fortunately, Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General of the United States, took up his cause and got him exonerated, and proved that the evidence was spurious, that had blamed one individual for this death that had occurred of a prison guard in the mayhem of the prison uprising. Splitting the Sky used to come to my class and explain vividly the nature of the crackdown to suppress the prison uprising, where he talked about African-American prisoners being put to the floor and just executed, having rifles, he said, rammed up their anuses and having their bodies blown apart. Splitting the Sky himself was actually pushed off a very high wall by prison guards in an attempted murder by the prison guards, he said. And luckily he survived, but he always had back problems ever since. But he came out of prison thanks to Ramsey Clark. He stayed in Ramsey Clark's house afterwards. They befriended one another. And Splitting the Sky embraced the American Indian movement and the struggles of the indigenous peoples of North America to unite and to resist imperialism, colonialism, both domestically and abroad. But he found, because he's Mohawk, so he's allowed to live in Canada and the United States, because Mohawk territories transcends the US-Canada border, which of course, yes, from their perspective, the indigenous peoples is a kind of fictitious border because it was made by the imperialists. So he gets to live in Canada, and he fell in love with a lady, married her, and ended up living in British Columbia in a small town called Chase, close to the Adams Lake Indian Reserve. So it's not far from where I am. And so I befriended Splitting the Sky when he was coming to my classes, and then along came 2009. Barack Obama was anointed as president of the United States, and George Bush lost his diplomatic immunity. So we had this interesting situation where George Bush was deciding to come on his first visit to a foreign country minus diplomatic immunity, to Calgary, Alberta, Canada, where I reside and where I'm speaking from today, to speak to an oil patch. You know, many people call Alberta Texas North, because it's, you know, an oil country. And, so a group named Lawyers Against the War mobilized and informed the relevant authorities that Canada in the year 2000 had enacted the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, as well as the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act that had been amended to have provisions for arresting war criminals, arresting people that the law stated actually if they were just suspected in a very tenuous way of having possibly been involved in torture or war crimes or crimes against humanity, that they must be apprehended as soon as they set foot in Canada. Either they should be prohibited from entering Canada, or they should be arrested on the spot and then proven to be guilty or innocent in a court of law. So this group named Lawyers Against the War, which is headed by a lawyer named Gail Davidson, who resides in Vancouver, so we're all kind of in Western Canada as activists mobilizing for this, with the Lawyers Against the War writing very, legalistic letters to the authorities, who obviously were non-responsive, who were willing to put the law aside for political expediency to not apply the law consistently, because George Bush is the former president of the United States. So he came to Calgary, and Splitting the Sky, I drove him to the protest outside the TELUS Convention Center in downtown Calgary, where Bush was speaking to his audience. And Splitting the Sky, he got out my car and he said, "Oh, Josh, I need that bag of my documents." I remember he had a white bag with documents in, and they were the different legal documents which were expounded for the authorities, written by Gail Davidson of Lawyers Against the War. And so many people can see this on YouTube, Splitting the Sky approaching the line of impunity that had been erected by the police, who were protecting the criminal and trying to keep out those of us who were trying to uphold the rule of law in Canada. Splitting the Sky went up to that line of police officers and said, "Are you going to arrest George Bush? And if not, I am." And he tried to push through them, was arrested for obstructing a police officer. And I think, obviously in Canada there's a lot of racism against Aboriginals displayed by the police force. Indeed, just in February of this year, Human Rights Watch published a damning report in which contained allegations made by Aboriginal women in British Columbia that the police have been raping and abusing them, have been taking them, in some instances, it has been alleged, to basements to sodomize them, and have been setting police dogs on Aboriginal children and so on, using firearms against Aboriginal children. So the approach of the police towards Aboriginals is particularly ruthless in this part of the world. And so I think the police thought, "Oh, we're just banging up another native." But to their surprise, it turned out that this individual was Splitting the Sky. And so Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General, was on the phone to the Calgary Police Force saying, "Make sure you don't leave a scratch on him because he's my former client." And so on. And so that was what happened on March 17th, 2009. Another thing I should mention, which was of course one of the reasons Splitting the Sky was motivated to try to apprehend George Bush and see justice visited upon the protagonists of the War on Terror, was because Splitting the Sky was in New York City on September 10th. He'd actually been invited there by a Rockefeller who, ironically, was, at least nominally, was feeling guilty for the actions of his father in the crackdown on Attica in 1971. And he invited Splitting the Sky to come and stay in the Marriott Hotel, all expenses paid, through September 11th. But Splitting the Sky felt somewhat queasy, felt there was something wrong. He was seeing FEMA agents, he said, in the vicinity on September 9th, September 10th, 2001. So he said to his wife and kids.
He had his family with him, too. He had his wife and children, if I'm not mistaken.
Indeed, yes, he had his wife and children with him. So he said, "Look, let's bail out, let's call it a day, let's go to see our relative elsewhere." And then 9/11 happened, and the Marriott Hotel, I believe, experienced many deaths. So that was kind of suspicious in and of itself. But, Splitting the Sky was someone who had been conspired against, who understood the way power works in North America. Of course, he was someone who himself had been tortured, been abused, and so he wasn't someone who was really, he had a keen eye. He wasn't someone who was gullible and willing to accept the propaganda of the elite in the United States. And, he more or less took for granted that the official story of 9/11 was false, even before he had sort of looked into the evidence which vindicated that intuition. But so he instantly began talking about 9/11, asking questions about 9/11, and slowly but surely became an expert on the minutiae of what did and did not happen on 9/11. He became an expert on the evidence, especially tracing the money back to, people like Larry Silverstein. And, many of these actors, Split in the Sky, sort of knew indirectly, because actually, when he was released from prison, a Democratic mayoral candidate in New York City hosted a wine and cheese party for him. And Rudy Giuliani took that up of, this opponent of mine is hosting a cop killer, took that up as an issue. So Split in the Sky and Giuliani had effectively clashed in the past. And so many of these individuals, they weren't new to Split in the Sky. He sort of knew about these different corrupt oligarchs in the United States and the extent of their nefarious activities.
And the Rockefellers themselves.
Yes, and the Rockefellers themselves. Yeah, the towers were Nelson.
That goes back to Attica in 71 with Nelson Rockefeller during the rebellion, which lasted days, and the civil rights attorney William Kunstler was trying to negotiate a settlement there without any violence, and then Nelson Rockefeller let the National Guard and the state troopers just basically have their turkey shoot, and the rest of that. But I think he had a history with the Rockefellers, and they had a history with New York City and the Twin Towers and the whole New World Order and the banking and the financiers and I jumped in. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Joshua. I just wanted to throw that in for the listeners.
Yes, of course, the Twin Towers were nicknamed David and Nelson Rockefeller, weren't they? So that was quite symbolic. Although I've often, this is on a tangent, but I've often wondered whether, the Rockefellers, they were like very complicit in the Holocaust, in what happened in World War II, because their Standard Oil of New Jersey, I guess, helped to found Auschwitz as a place to create rocket fuel from coal. And so I've often wondered, many people think 9/11 was an Israeli operation. I almost wonder whether it was like kind of revenge by the Zionist faction of the elite on David and Nelson Rockefeller, these symbols of the Rockefellers, who were aligned with the non-Jewish faction of the American elite. But that's just speculative on my part. But anyway, so Split in the Sky was evidently, his guiding philosophy was, screw you, you criminalized me and ruined part of my life because I tried to steal a sandwich. And yet every day we see these people in the elite, these people running the United States, violating laws, international laws, violating moral principles, basic moral principles like respect for human life. You condone the violation of human life in the prison system in North America. You torture people, you murder people wantonly, and yet you're criminalizing us for doing things like stealing a sandwich. In the case of George Jackson, I think he tried to rob $70 from a gas station. And so as I say, this inside prison Split, this guy read a lot, and instead of breaking him, it made him, and it formed his personality as a revolutionary, as someone who wanted a radical change in North America, didn't want the status quo to prevail. And he was.
And again, I apologize for interrupting, but I think this might be a good point to bring Larry Pinkney, the co-host, in on this, because the story of Splitting the Sky, which you're relating right now, Joshua, parallels almost to the T Larry Pinkney's story. Larry, I don't know if you know this, is a veteran of the Black Panther Party. Back around the same time, he and Splitting the Sky are around the same age, and he too was set up and put in prison and experienced the horrific violence that goes on there. And if you don't mind, I'd like to introduce you to Larry, Joshua, and let
by all means,
Larry.
Yes, I'm very keen to hear his perspective. Yes, by all means.
Yes. Is this a good time for you to jump in, Larry, do you think?
Sure, it's fine. It's fine. First of all, Joshua, I'd like to say that we are deeply gratified, frankly, to have you on the program. And I am going to put you on the spot as my comrade and brother, because I am going to ask you to be extremely personal about your experiences with respect to splitting the sky, because I think our wonderful audience out there wants to hear that. But before I do that, let me just give you a little bit of my own background, political history. Brother Phil is absolutely correct. I am a veteran of the Black Panther Party. I spent approximately 10 years as a political prisoner. I'm the former Minister of Interior of the Republic of New Africa. And by the way, Joshua, I am the former co-chair of the Native Brotherhood at Mission Prison in British Columbia, Canada. I'm also the only U.S. citizen to have successfully self-authored, and I emphasize self-authored, a case to the United Nations Human Rights Committee from prison also, which emanated, frankly, and specifically from none other than British Columbia, Canada. So now, having said that... It's a small world then. Yes, it is indeed. It is indeed. Having said that, I am asking you, my brother, my friend, my comrade, to elucidate a bit. Tell us a bit. Tell the audience, the more personal, the better. Tell us what you personally know of this incredible brother, this incredible comrade splitting the sky. Tell us what you know of him. I mean, you're our guest, so I'm not going to go into what I know. There'll be an article out on Thursday, this coming Thursday, the 21st, in the Black Commentator. I'm an editorial board member and columnist with the Black Commentator, blackcommentator.com. Anyway, which is dedicated entirely, this column will be dedicated entirely to splitting the sky. But you're very special, Joshua, because you can tell the audience things that many of them may not know. For example, with respect to John Lennon and, no, I'm going to leave that up to you. But make it personal, make it real. I write a column called Keeping It Real. Not to say you haven't been real, you have been, but even get a little bit realer. So I'm going to turn it right back to you, Joshua, from that perspective, if you don't mind, comrade.
Yeah, no problem, comrade. I can do that too. Well, I mean, obviously, I had times where I drank beer with Splitting the Sky, where we chilled out. But he was someone who was definitely committed to politics first and foremost. He was a passionate speaker. He was someone who could really keep the audience awake with his, vivid descriptions of, things that university students don't normally see. When he'd lecture to my class, Professor Hall, who was his friend and my mentor, would introduce to the class saying, look, mostly university experiences are sort of white, middle-class, bourgeois experiences. And I remember, Splitting the Sky would come on campus, and the first thing he'd say was, hey, this university, it kind of feels like a prison, And it's a kind of similar structure in that sense. It's got a lot of backstabbing, and power requires the university system that, behaves itself the same way the prison system people have to behave themselves in there. And so Splitting the Sky would come on campus, and it would be a unique experience for students to appreciate that and hear that. To hear, speaking with his stentorian voice, describing the many experiences that he's had as a fighter, as a warrior, fighting against the powers that be, talking about the Ku Klux Klan style prison guards, talking about life on the streets of Buffalo, New York when he was homeless, talking about what it was like being in solitary confinement for months on end. These were the kinds of things that you could read about in a textbook, but it really brought it home, and it was less abstract when he came to talk to us as students. And, it was noticeable that when Splitting the Sky would speak, there would always be like I don't know, like 10 girls would go up and talk to him afterwards. You know, I think he had this very macho, like super testosterone kind of personality that was perhaps attractive to some young ladies. I think, he had obviously a beautiful wife and kids though, but, you know, that was one thing you noticed, that people really appreciated him speaking to them. And obviously there's so many, dimensions to his story, and, you know, if he had a few beers, he'd go into the fights he'd had and, you know, different things. But, you know, generally speaking, he was someone who realized that, the world wasn't going to change by itself, that we had to mobilize to change the world, and he sought to, light a path for others to follow. He sought to set an example for others to emulate. And he really, for example, disdained those in the peace movement, so-called, and those in the activist community who wouldn't deal with the incontrovertible evidence that 9/11 was a false flag attack. And I remind you that Splitting the Sky was one of the early people to realize that 9/11 was a false flag operation. In fact, the only reason I ended up looking into 9/11 was because he persuaded my professor to come off the fence and start making positive statements about what actually happened on 9/11, which he did. And that led me to walk into a class where I had a professor who was questioning 9/11, and that led me to get into this myself. So I'm very appreciative to the fact that he actually, dealt with 9/11, was straight out speaking about the fact that the official story was false. In fact, he claims that after he left New York on September 10th or September 9th, 2001, he went up to McGill University in Montreal, and that he said they banned him from campus because he was talking in that vein and saying that he felt that the official story of 9/11 was false, and that 9/11 was done by actors within the United States to gain political capital to justify wars of aggression abroad. And so, as I say, being in prison, it made him politically astute. He wasn't someone who was willing to take bullshit. I think he was someone who never probably expected to live as long as he did. And so as a result, he was willing to put his body on the line. He engaged in an armed rebellion against the authorities in British Columbia. He tried to arrest George Bush, which was actually quite risky. The police officer that arrested him, I gather, has killed 3 people in his career as a police officer, and he claimed in court that he had apprehended Splitting the Sky in order to protect him from Bush's henchmen, who would, he said, have shot at Splitting the Sky. So Splitting the Sky, as I say, is someone who is willing to put his body on the line, willing to take many of the risks that many in the activist community just aren't willing to take. And in that sense, he set an example for others to follow. And that's why I think there's such an outcry and so much upset throughout. I'm surprised at how many people I'm sort of being contacted by and how many people I see on Facebook who are mourning, this tragic death of him, because he was someone it was inspirational. And I think that, the analogy with Che Guevara isn't a false analogy. I think it's apposite, because he is somebody who, as I say, risked losing everything, took the risks necessary in order to attempt to realize the political goals that he wanted to see, come to fruition. So.
Absolutely. I mean, Joshua, let me say this, if I may. Thank you so much, and I'm going to keep on pushing for the personal, because I think that really makes a strong impact with our listeners. It certainly makes a strong impact with me. Let me say this, that with respect to 9/11, even beyond 9/11. But 9/11, of course, was a deep cover operation, to as you indicated, really to rationalize, fallaciously rationalize wars of aggression abroad, as well as the war against quote unquote civil liberties at home. But the beauty of Splitting the Sky, the beauty of this brother, this father, this comrade, was that he was relentless. He kept coming back over and over and over again. In fact, some people referred to him as the Che Guevara of North America. Actually, we refer to Splitting the Sky as the Che Guevara of the Americas, because he, like Che, was determined to do everything that he possibly could on a political, educational, social level to raise the consciousness of everyday black, white, brown, red, and yellow brothers and sisters, really throughout the world. And having had some experience with myself, with the Canadian and American governments, and that's an understatement, and their surreptitious nature and how they act against the best interests of the people, all the people, I can say that it really is imperative that we understand, and you said this, and I want to emphasize it. It is imperative that we emulate the example of such great freedom fighters and warriors, if you will, such as, splitting the sky. We are all splitting the skies, or we should be all splitting the skies, and we have that obligation and that responsibility. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, having been a political prisoner myself. By the way, I heard Phil say that you had written for Canadian Dimension magazine, or had been publishing Canadian Dimension, right? Yeah. Is that right? Yeah. Ironically, the first publication that published me when I was in prison. I had written prior to being in prison and been published prior to being in prison. But when I was in prison, at the behest of the Canadian and American authorities in British Columbia, Canada, and then later in California, the first publication was none other than Canadian Dimension magazine. And in fact, the piece that I wrote was literally smuggled out, because I wrote the piece from solitary confinement on toilet paper that was smuggled out to another prisoner, who in turn smuggled it to another prisoner, who in turn got it out to Canadian Dimension. So I must say I feel a special kinship with you, my comrade. Anyway, getting back to... Go ahead, brother.
Well, that's good that you got published in the Canadian Dimension. That's what I was going to say. And I think it's great that you managed to smuggle out your story from prison. I mean, I think it's so important that, prison is so often so isolated from the rest of society that I really think it's important that young people especially get to hear from people who have experienced the brutal penal system in North America. And I remember Spit in the Sky used to lament the reality that the prison system in North America has worsened and hasn't improved since the 1970s and 80s in many ways, because of the prison industrial complex now, the privatization of prisons, the sophisticated tools of oppression that they have now, like tear gas and cameras everywhere and so on. And so I think it's really great. I mean, I'd be happy to hear more from you in this show, because, when I say things like George Jackson dying, like for me, that's just something I read about online or hear about from people like Split in the Sky, but you lived through that, so perhaps you can contextualize for the audience what was so significant about the murder of George Jackson.
Absolutely. And comrade brother, the reality is, and I emphasize this and re-emphasize this, that our struggle, and once again, I must, as Smokey Robinson might say, second that emotion. I have to back you up on what you said in terms of the necessity and need to carry on this struggle. Because, as you said, things have gotten worse, and you are absolutely correct. And that's what Splitting the Sky saw. He saw that things were getting worse, not only in the sense of the physical sense, but in the psychological sense, the numbing of people's minds, the numbing of people's hearts, the lack of critical thinking and critical analysis of our situation. And I have to reiterate, if I may, the special kinship that I feel with you, though we've never directly met. But as soon as I heard Canadian Dimension magazine, it brought back all kinds of memories to me of solitary confinement, both in Canadian prisons, as well as in California, USA prisons. But I am very, very, very pleased, honored, happy, delighted to have you. You're in BC, right? British Columbia right now, right?
I'm in Alberta, just adjacent to British Columbia.
Oh, you're in Alberta. Okay. So you're up there, as we would say. Excuse me, folks in Michigan. It's the Big Upper Peninsula. It's Canada, and Alberta. I've only been through Alberta. In fact, I was with some Indigenous Native brothers and sisters when I was there. But I think it's a very, very special thing to have you on our program, and I urge you to just let it loose, because we want to hear what you have to say about splitting the sky, especially as it relates to what we, everyday, ordinary, black, white, red, yellow, brown people, all of us need to be doing today. So let me shut up for a minute here. That's hard to do sometimes. But let me shut up for a minute and go back to you and Phil.
Well, thanks, Larry. Go ahead, Joshua.
Well, it's funny because I'm just sitting here with my big computer screen in front of me, and I saw the Vancouver Sun popped up with the headline that native peace activist John Boncore is found dead. So that's kind of ironic, that headline. So the Vancouver Sun have a piece out right now on the death of Splitting the Sky. But yes, I think Splitting the Sky, there was the trial, which was a whole interesting series of events where, Splitting the Sky actually had a trial for attempting to arrest George Bush here in Calgary.
A year later, right? March of 2010, I believe. A year later after the attempted arrest.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, about a year later, and it was here in Calgary, where I am right now. And yes, that was interesting. So he was charged with obstructing a police officer, and so obviously it got into this issue of, well, what's the law, right? And Splitting the Sky, coming from the Mohawk tribe, used to talk a lot about the I think it's the Guyanagoa, like the fact that the Mohawk people were well known for being promoters of law, and many even say that the U.S. Constitution is actually a plagiarism, effectively, of the Constitution of being able to impeach a leader and having a 2/3 majority, stuff like that, from the Mohawk people, who were kind of very prominent, a prominent feature in the 13 colonies and the colonization of North America. A lot to do with the secession of the 13 colonies had to do with the politics revolving around the Mohawk people, who ended up allying with the British Crown. And so Canada has had a history of having alliances with Aboriginal peoples. Like in the War of 1812, the last time the United States was invaded was by Canada in the War of 1812. And actually the British military at that time were tied up with the Napoleonic Wars. And so you had this Tecumseh, the Indian fighter Tecumseh, and his Indian Confederacy. They allied with the Crown and defended Canada against the United States, who was trying to annex Canada. And so Canada has a history that's slightly a tiny bit better than the United States, in the sense that there was an attempt to strike treaties, to build alliances with indigenous peoples. Many people would like to see that legacy continue, where the Aboriginal nations relate to the state, to the Canadian state, as nations relate to one another, for example, in the European Union, where you have different sovereign nations under the rubric of the European Union, and many indigenous peoples would like to see their sovereignty respected, and therefore for there to be nation-to-nation negotiations in Canada. And so Splitting the Sky was aware of that Mohawk history, was aware of the fact that Mohawks themselves were proponents of law, And so he definitely was someone who was incensed when he saw elites trying to overlook laws that were inconvenient to them, as is what was the case and is the case, for example, with Canada's quite progressive legislation contained in the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. And so he got into court and said, well, you're accusing me of obstructing a police officer, but that's like like a international law or one of the more prominent laws that should supersede this. Rather, that's kind of a petty bylaw that you can't obstruct a police officer at a protest or something like that. That should be considered in a secondary nature to the international legal doctrine that prohibits wars of aggression, that says that people who instigate wars of aggression should be arrested. And as I say, in Canada's legislation, federal legislation, any people who are suspected of having been involved in war crimes should be arrested. And so, unfortunately, he was found guilty in court of obstructing a police officer, even though obviously the police officers were obstructing him from seeing justice, justice served upon George W. Bush, who is perhaps one of the most reviled war criminals on our planet. And so the trial was interesting, though, because Ramsey Clark came to town, Cynthia McKinney came to town. I can tell that Cynthia was definitely infatuated with Splitting the Sky's approach to political discourse. I think it's the same combative approach that she embraces. Cynthia McKinney, of course, is the former U.S. Congresswoman who found herself ousted when she decided to side with the Palestinians. She found basically the Israel lobby turning against her in the United States because she took a stand with the colonized of Palestine. And so Cynthia McKinney came in, Ramsey Clark came in. He actually testified in court, Ramsey, to the judge, that he knew that Splitting the Sky would never lie, that he felt like Splitting the Sky was a son to him, he said. So that was the intimacy between Ramsey Clark, this historic figure in the United States history, and Splitting the Sky. And I agree with, you saying he's the Che Guevara of the Americas, because, Che Guevara was murdered more than half a century ago, or about less than half a century, I suppose, but roughly half a century ago. And, there has to be people who follow up these iconoclastic figures who light a path for people to follow, and who set such a fine example as Che Guevara did. Of course, Che Guevara personified internationalism, the idea that even though he was born in Argentina, that if the people of Cuba are oppressed, or the people of Bolivia or the people of Congo are oppressed, that it was incumbent upon him to link arms with his fellow workers, link arms with the oppressed, and to resist the oppressors. And I think Splitting the Sky also embodied and personified such internationalism, that when he saw these Muslims in Abu Ghraib prison, in Guantanamo Bay, the evidence of them being brutalized, tortured, maimed, and in many instances Muslims being massacred en masse, I believe that he empathized with them, because he not only was someone who himself had been tortured and brutalized. Oh, I was just suggesting that, the principles of internationalism that Che Guevara in such an exemplary way demonstrated for us. I think Splitting the Sky was someone who really embraced that. He wasn't somebody who allowed himself to be parochial, in the sense that he wasn't just solely concerned with Aboriginal matters. I think some people allow themselves to become just concerned with ethnic politics, shall we say. But he was someone who managed to strike a balance between not selling out his own people, but rather using the struggles of his people, using the heritage of the Mohawk people as an example for how humanity can relate to one another and can interact with each other. Yeah. And so I think he was someone who liked to use his ethnic politics not as something that divided us, but something that united us. And I really respected him for that. As I say, he could walk into university campuses with white middle-class bourgeois kids who are saying, oh, I'm paying my university tuition fees for high-quality pedagogy, and he could really meet the standard and go beyond it. He was an eloquent speaker. I think in prison, I guess he must have just read dozens of books. And I know that, in that era, there was a lot of Marxist literature going around, the examples set by the Black Panthers, the liberation struggles taking place in the United States and outside the United States were food for thought, and they stimulated the kinds of discussions that we need to reignite in this era, this dark age that we've entered. I heard someone the other day saying, comparing our era to the Dark Ages is an insult to the Dark Ages, and I think that's kind of true because
our representative governments are truly practicing barbarism all over the planet, and in the name of 9/11, and this is where I'd like to get back to 9/11 and splitting the sky, knowing the next day, because I'd like to suggest to the listeners to check the YouTube video or Google video search. It's Splitting the Sky, 9/11 Follow the Money, and that's from a talk he gave in Canada in November of 2008. And Splitting the Sky, he just immediately did what any law enforcement or detective would do. You follow the money, who benefited in this crime. And you have all these 9/11 documentaries that focus on the buildings coming down, the architects and engineers, and the air defense stand down, and all of those films are important. But Splitting the Sky went after following the money, and that's where you find the culprits. And so again, the name of that video, it's about an hour and a half long, Splitting the Sky, 9/11, Follow the Money. And what gets me, though, back to the citizen's arrest in March 17, 2009 in Alberta was it got around on the internet, and by that time I'd been involved with the anti-war organizations, 4 years, I guess, and is very familiar with all the websites and on the various email lists, and Splitting the Sky did get the attention for trying to arrest George Bush, but the thing was, after that, when the anti-war people found out that he zeroed in on 9/11, the actual story given to us all to justify the war on terror, they kind of dropped him. You know what I'm saying, Joshua?
Yes, it was disgraceful and despicable. He put his body on the line, and one of the many pieces of evidence that he cited to justify apprehending George Bush was the obvious fact that George Bush was clearly at least told about or involved in this obvious false flag operation on 9/11. But unfortunately, as we know, with the history of COINTELPRO, for example, in the United States, the leadership of the activist community and the peace movement, to a large extent, not in every case and with every person, but to a large extent has been infiltrated, co-opted, and there are certain red lines that are drawn where you can talk about torture, you can talk about how invading countries is illegal, but when it gets into these deeper events, these what Peter Dale Scott calls deep politics, it becomes taboo, and I think that's artificial. I think that's created by agents provocateurs or infiltrators, fake activists in the peace movement. I mean, I remember after Splitting the Sky started getting shunned, I went to Saskatchewan in the province of the city of Saskatchewan or Saskatoon in the province of Saskatchewan in the middle of Canada, where George Bush came for a subsequent speech. Evidently, Canada is a safe haven for war criminals from Texas and Tel Aviv. And George Bush came to speak once more, and I got this amazing video that people can see online where there's the leader of the peace movement saying, I'd like to thank the police. We worked really closely with the police for this event to make sure it went by peace. Yeah. And I got on the microphone and I was like, so you're working with the police who are yet again.
Oh my God.
Yet again, they're protecting the war criminal. We should be really, one thing my professor Anthony Hall and myself and Splitting the Sky tried to do when we went to these Arrest George Bush events was to turn the protest not against George Bush necessarily, but against the police, because the police are constantly using laws, draconian laws, to criminalize working class people. But when it comes to implementing laws which are unambiguous, the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act is unambiguous that war criminals should be arrested, they protect the war criminal. So those who kill one person are called a criminal, but those who kill 1 million people, as has been demonstrated with Iraq, at least 1 million people, get called statesmen and get called internationally protected persons.
Absolutely.
So we used to try and turn the protest. We used to try and turn the protest onto the cops. We used to start getting in front of these cops and saying, do your job, enforce the law. Do your job, enforce the law, right? We would protest the police primarily for letting down Canadians by not asserting our sovereignty and not asserting domestic and international law. And so that was the reality. And unfortunately, the peace movement has been so heavily compromised that you have you have leaders of the activist community actively working in connivance with those very police officers who ought to be being indicted and protested for abrogating and overlooking laws that are politically inexpedient to implement.
Well, here's something,
absolutely. Go ahead. Go ahead,
Joshua. Thank you. Here's something that it doesn't have to be this difficult to understand. And Larry and I were speaking about this earlier tonight on the telephone. But just think about it, Joshua. The fact that there's a 9/11 truth movement in the first place should make one think about this, because 9/11 is the reason given for the war. So if you're against the war, you would be examining the reason given for the war, and if you found any weakness in that reasoning, you would be highlighting it and exposing it to take away the justification. So the fact that there's a 9/11 truth movement in addition to an anti-war movement, two separate things right there, shows that we've got a problem there with these misleaders. But Larry and I were speaking earlier, and this has to do with splitting the sky, standing up all alone. Well, you guys had his back, but I mean, he's the guy who went up to the police line. He's the one who risked imprisonment. He's the one who got slammed down to the ground. And then we've got a lot of people that are onlookers. You know, and wow, isn't he great? And, you know, and you type in all this stuff honoring him and, you know, or what a great guy. But if we really want to honor him, we pick up the baton, you know.
That's right. If look, Phil, if we really want to honor, him, then we emulate him.
Yes.
We emulate his example, okay? That's why Howard Zinn talked about the necessity to know history. You know, when we think of 9/11, okay, you know, 9/11, what was 9/11? 9/11 was nothing more than a successful and bloody conspiracy against the people of both the United States and the world. That's what 9/11 was. And splitting the sky came right out there and made that clear. That's what we should be doing. The conspiracy is real. It's against everyday, ordinary people around the world.
It's still the justification for it, and so we've got work to do. And as Joshua mentioned, and I think we've already hit the 1 hour mark, so we're going to have to take a break in a minute. Yes, but as Joshua already mentioned, and this is something you and I are well aware of, Larry, that these movements and activist groups are on both left and right. You know, anything that's a threat to the status quo. The status quo is infiltrates it and controlled opposition and such. And we were speaking earlier, Larry, and you've been preaching this for a while. The hell with this misleadership. We don't need them,
right.
And we need to act for ourselves. And the thing that Joshua was talking about, how Splitting the Sky was able to transcend all different peoples. The reason why was he stuck to principle.
Right.
If he saw something wrong, he spoke up, and it's just pursuing the truth and taking the truth wherever it leads us. And he was, as this obit says here, the picture of him being manhandled by the RCMPs. It says, "Rest in peace to activist and warrior for justice, Splitting the Sky." And I think I first learned of Splitting the Sky from a video from We Are Change Vancouver. They're one of the groups that put out the Splitting the Sky being arrested video back in 2009. And We Are Change, which has chapters all over Canada, U.S., everywhere, purely nonpartisan. They walk the walk. Their saying is, if you want justice, if you want peace, demand justice. If you want justice, demand the truth. If you want the truth, ask questions and demand answers. That's it. The formula is that simple. And so we've got gatekeepers, we've got misleaders, and there's a lot of blood being spilled, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And we have to pick up the ball and follow the money and get to bottom of 9/11. We have to make our fellows deal with it.
If we don't step forward and do the next right thing, nothing will be changed. But if we do step forward and do the right thing, we will be amazed at what will change.
Yes, and I see that as we spoke earlier, Joshua mentioned this, about the anti-war movement and how they've been totally ineffective as far as stopping the wars. And we talked about infiltration and misdirection, and as Professor Michelle Chossudovsky describes it, manufactured dissent. There is a Splitting the Sky video, a very short video. Dave may have played it already. It's about a minute and a half, and it's entitled Splitting the Sky. Where is it? Splitting the Sky, anti-war left, progressives, complicit in 9/11 cover-up. And it does show how the refusal by the leadership and those of influence within the anti-war organizations to bring attention to 9/11 and publicly question it, how that's allowed for these wars to not only go on but expand. And
let me elaborate on that. All right, let's not skirt the issue. Let's be real. All right, and we always have, and let's always continue to be. The fact of the matter is that U.S. President Barack Obama has not only continued, but he has expanded the policies of the G.W. Bush regime. In fact, he has taken it to the point, where now U.S. citizens in the country of the United States are now the targets of his kill list. Let's be blunt. Let's be honest. Let's not beat around the bush. All right? And I wasn't trying to be funny when I said the bush, beating around the bush. Let's be real. Barack Obama is a war criminal, as Cornel West finally came out and said a few weeks ago, as if, a half-blind person couldn't see that. But, the reality is that we have to call it as it really is. Not as we want it to be. We work for what we want to be, but we call it as it really is. And the leadership, and I emphasize the leadership of the so-called left and so-called progressives has, in fact, sold out the principles of real struggle. They have sold out the people, be they black, white, brown, red, or yellow. They have sold us out. Therefore, it is time for the people, everyday, ordinary people, to step up to the plate, pull no punches, and say it, expose it like it really is. As Joe Hill said, we need to not mourn, don't mourn, organize, get out there, educate, agitate, and organize. Go ahead.
And we are the answer, Larry. I mean, that was from the beginning. We ourselves are the answer, and hopefully these experiences, this 11, 12-year war on terror, hopefully by now we're learning that it's, to put our resistance and our fight in the hands of these misleaders ain't working. We're the answer. And I do want to say about Barack Obama, splitting the sky was one of the early known activists who endorsed our Central Florida chapter's resolution calling for the impeachment of Barack Obama for war crimes. And that was in 2010, because I came to know of him in 2009, and I didn't really follow up and reach out to him, Larry, until later in the year. And Kathy and I had wonderful conversations with him while he was his trial in March of 2010, and he endorsed our resolution to impeach Barack Obama for the same war crimes that Veterans for Peace, Code Pink, and all the David Swanson of AfterDowningStreet.org, all these people, Chris Hedges, Rocky Anderson, Mayor, how many other people called for impeachment publicly of George Bush? Well, Splitting the Sky stepped up and endorsed our resolution in 2010. Cindy Sheehan did as well. Professor Francis Boyle. These folks all stood on principle. And we finally did get the impeachment resolution passed at the national level, Joshua, with Veterans for Peace in August of 2011. And get this, I was called by the secretary, the national secretary, right after it was passed and told to keep quiet about it because they didn't know how they were going to handle it.
To keep quiet about it. Let me also put Cynthia McKinney's name in there, because Cynthia has also been, former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney has also been a very strong proponent of telling the truth, and not only with respect to 9/11, but with respect to the impeachment of Barack Obama. All right, and let's be real, let's be honest.
Yes, and we reached out to her actually 2 years to the day tomorrow. We're actually today, the 19th of March. President Barack Obama launched his own shock and awe attack on the African country of Libya. I mean, a blatant act of war. And I reached out to Cynthia McKinney that day, and she unequivocally endorsed our Senate Florida chapter resolution to impeach Obama. And the reason why I keep saying the Central Florida chapter resolution, because the national kept rejecting this resolution. They kept applying double standards. And actually, Larry Pinkney...
the national VFP, Veterans for Peace. I want to be clear. We're talking about the Central Florida chapter, emphasis on chapter of Veterans for Peace versus the national of Veterans for Peace. I'm sorry. Go ahead, bro.
And then it was, Larry, your own article in July of 2011, is it time to impeach President Barack Obama? And then your whole article was making clearly the case, yes. And that's when I reached out to you and came to know you, and we got the national rank and file membership, got this resolution passed in August of 2011 at the National Convention, and to this very day, 18 months later, there's still many people who call themselves anti-war activists who haven't even heard about it, because the national leadership of all the anti-war organizations have been very quiet about it. And so this is an example of regular old folks at the rank and file level just stepping forward like splitting the sky, just doing the right thing. And we need more people doing that, and those of us who've been able to step forward and speak up serve as an example for others. But we got to get more people to take that next step of doing the same thing. The hell with these leaders.
That's right. That's right.
The hell with them. We don't need them.
Yes. That's right.
I think that.
As we said, I'm sorry, Joshua, 1 second, and I'll shut up. Yep. But that's the whole point. The hell with them. The hell with the so-called leadership, because they're nothing but misleadership. They're punking us out. They're pimping the people, the pain of the people. That's what they're doing. Understand that. That's what they're doing. What we are and who we are reaching out to are we everyday black, white, brown, red, and yellow people across the board, across this nation, across Mother Earth, globally. The everyday people. That's who we want. That's who we need. That and only that, we and only we the people will make the change. I'm done. Go back. Go home now.
I know, Joshua, you wanted to add something there.
Yes, well, I mean, I think it's clear that the politicians these days are stooges, are puppets of entrenched elites who have a lot of capital, a lot of hegemonic power over society. And so I've often heard the phrase caretaker government, where we're told by our media that, all power is derived from the people and that our politicians are the embodiment of the power of the people kind of thing. But we know in reality that that's not the case, that we're offered in elections a choice between Pepsi and Coke, the choice between two political leaders who have very little difference between them. And so I think that I'm sensing, especially among veterans, a great sense of betrayal. I think many veterans, who were in the US military in the Cold War, maybe they did perceive, communism to be this kind of evil enemy and that they were defending democracy. But, so I think there's many veterans who used to kind of buy into the American dream, used to buy into the American empire to some extent. And I think you see that presence on veterans today, for example, who since 9/11 have sensed a great, or who have demonstrated that they feel a great sense of betrayal towards the government, towards those leaders who, for example, those congresspersons who won't go along with the impeachment of George Bush when he was in power, and now the impeachment of Obama, who don't speak out against the kind of self-inflicted wounds that the American empire is inflicting upon itself, who don't speak out about the power of Israel lobbyists in the United States. I mean, I think I do perceive that many people think that the Israelis are controlling U.S. foreign policy now, that the U.S. used to have a more benign foreign policy in relation to the Middle East. I mean, if you actually look prior to 9/11, the U.S. had very, very seldom intervened overtly with its military in the Middle East because they used to have a policy of wanting to foment stability in the Middle East, which was conducive to oil markets, so they propped up Arab strongmen. But what's particularly pernicious these days is that you have this kind of Israeli Likudnik agenda to balkanize the Middle East and to create sectarianism and divisiveness, and to make the different confessional groups and factions in the Middle East fight each other, promoting ethnic genocide and ethnic civil war. So all the Muslims and Arabs are fighting each other rather than the Israeli Zionist cuckoo in the nest. And I think that that's a reality that has led U.S. policy to metastasize and become worse than it actually was in the Cold War, where it was more benign. If you look at the Eisenhower Doctrine, which was declared in the 1950s, there was this idea that, well, we want stability in the Middle East, so you prop up different states. And while that's imperfect, it was a lot better than what we've seen since 9/11, which is this attempt to balkanize the Middle East and weaken the Middle East so no country can stand up to Israel. And it's quite clear that if you look at the US media, if you look at who the neoconservatives were, that there was a heavy Zionist presence there, people who are often being referred to as unregistered agents of a foreign government, people who really had the best interest of Israel at heart and weren't really that interested in what happened to the United States, and they only wanted to use American young men and women as cannon fodder for this Israeli agenda, so Israel can continue to expand. And of course, Iraq, Saddam Hussein fired Scud missiles at Israel in 1991. It was offering money, stipends to the families of people who died in operations of resistance against the Israeli government. So Saddam Hussein was, he was an Arab nationalist, and he was someone who eventually, got off his leash. Although he was initially under the control of the Americans, he got off his leash and he used to stand up to Israel. And we also saw, of course, with George Bush Sr., that he personified that what's often called the realist school of thought, that he wanted to continue with what was good for oil business. And often it's noted that in the 1990s that the Zionists and the George Bush Sr. administration actually clashed over the future vision for the Middle East, because George Bush Sr., for example, when he invaded Kuwait somewhat reluctantly, he did not go on and take out Saddam Hussein, right? Because he wanted to go back to the status quo ante of stability for oil markets. And all the Zionists during the first Gulf War were saying, oh, you should go and take out Saddam Hussein, and he never did that. So I think 9/11, and of course there was Israeli agents arrested on 9/11, and many other Israeli fingerprints on the 9/11 operation, was largely done to facilitate this Israeli agenda of reordering the Middle East. Some people have referred to it as a Sykes-Picot II. There was the Sykes-Picot agreement that created the Arab states in the first place. And many people have referred to this as a Sykes-Picot II, a reordering of the Middle East, which wasn't the U.S.'s foreign policy initially. Throughout the Cold War, that wasn't the U.S.'s Middle East policy. But I know that somebody earlier asked about following the money and, what splitting the sky.
Yes, and that's what I wanted to bring us back to. All this is well and good, Joshua, but the fact of the matter is all this is going on in the name of the official story of 9/11, which is a total fraud, and it's going to continue, until we, the people, get honest about it and deal with it. And I think it's in there. Oh, great! Right. Hello, caller.
Hi, Phil. This is Tom Santoni. I want to thank
we thought it might be you. Yes,
you were right. I want to thank you and Larry and especially Joshua for your program tonight. It's very enlightening. Originally, I called in to find out if there were any suspicious circumstances surrounding Splitting the Sky's death. I mean, he was only 61 years old. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, a young man.
Well, that's unclear. That's unclear at this stage. I mean, we can never know, and it's obviously sensitive around his wife and his family if we go down that path. And if we kind of let the genie out the bottle and start going down that path, we're going to have all kinds of speculation on the internet that might, be upsetting to his family. I myself have not opined in that regard, but I do think it's something we should open our minds to. It'll be interesting to see what the coroner says. I still don't really know the circumstances of how he fully died. I guess he was just found in his house on the floor dead. It's hard, unless we're there to evaluate the evidence at the scene of the crime, it's very hard, or the scene of his death, it's very hard to know what actually transpired.
Right, and more will be revealed, Tom. And Joshua, his website, we read it off earlier, it's Joshua Blakeney.info, and he'll be able to relay the news as it breaks.
Yeah, people should add me on Twitter and Facebook. That's where I post stuff, actually.
Well, my other comment or question of you guys is, Phil and I have a mutual friend here in Northeast Florida who, who believes that the only way that we are going to get sufficient change to begin to turn things around is to assemble a minimum of 1 million people, like everyday people, on the mall in Washington, D.C., and demand decent governance. Now, I've heard, more than one of you tonight say things are continuing to get worse, and I completely agree with you. No matter what we seem to do, things continue to get worse. And the so-called anti-war leadership in this country, be it Veterans for Peace or United for Peace and Justice or Answer or Move On, they're just awash in their own institutionalism. I tend to agree with our mutual friend that assembling 1 million people on the mall would begin to get the attention not only of the media, but also the government. But what are the chances of that happening? What do you guys think about the idea and the chances of it actually happening?
Can I go on?
Go ahead, Phil.
Because I know who Tom is speaking of, and we face this at a local level. Larry, as you know, here in Daytona Beach, our little group of Vets for Peace and Code Pink and We Are Change, it really is a handful of people. Every week, every Thursday night for the past 7+ years, we show up and we do our anti-war demo, where not only do we hold signs, but we have flyers and DVDs that we pass out to the cars during the drive home. And I've heard over the years from people saying, God, there's only a few of you. If how are you taken seriously? If you had 100 people, then I'd join you, right? And the response to that is, how are we going to get to 100 if you're not one of them? And that's what I have to say to our friend Tom, that we've got to be the answer ourselves, and we've got to be one of that million instead of wait for 1 million, then I'll join you, and that's my answer. Larry?
My answer is simply this, and I'm going to quote the words of the late anthropologist Margaret Mead, who said, quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful people can make a difference. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has," unquote. Again, a small group of thoughtful people can make a difference. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has, unquote. My point is simply this. We begin where we begin. Okay? And Tom, I think that we can have more than, frankly, 1 million people every damn day. But in order to do this, we must get each and every one of those, and I don't mean to be disrespectful by saying this, but of those couch potatoes, I'll call them conscious couch potatoes, who know what the hell is going on. Get out there, get involved, do something about it, speak up, do something, organize, educate, agitate. And so I think it is possible, but we must begin where we begin, wherever that may be. Yes, that is my point.
Yes.
Are you aware in Canada we've had the Idle No More movement recently, where throughout Canada, ubiquitously indigenous peoples have mobilized and have come to their shopping malls, come to the centers of their town to protest some radical changes that are happening, thanks to the Harper government. And so that's been quite promising. And, with the warmer weather coming, I think that we have reason to be positive about the future on this side of the 49th parallel. We right now have a very right-wing, extremist, Zionist, neocon government that's actually implementing radical changes in almost every aspect of society. They're actually passing through Parliament some very dodgy pieces of legislation called like omnibus bills. So whereas it used to be the case that you debate like a narrow topic, like do we want to change gun laws or change the laws about Aboriginal peoples, what they're doing now is they have these omnibus bills which package together like changes to like every aspect of Canadian society, and they just vote on that one bill. And they have a majority of seats in the Canadian Parliament. One of the great things about Canada historically has been that the right wing, the Conservatives, have never been able to attain a majority of seats in Canada's Parliament. So in 2011, they committed election fraud and managed to seize the majority of seats in Canada's Parliament. And now they're radically implemented this right-wing agenda. But fortunately, as any physicist will tell you, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And just as their draconian maneuvers changing Canada from the top down, from the bottom up, the people are becoming less apathetic and are waking up and demanding change. And it's the Aboriginal, the Indigenous peoples who are leading the way, because they're the people who have been putting up with getting the rough end of things for much longer than the rest of Canada has. And so there's reason to be sanguine in Canada, insofar as the people of Canada are now linking arms and continuing to protest what's going on. And of course, Canada has this big enclave of resources that feeds China and the United States. It's a resource superpower, and many Indigenous peoples are blocking the roads that are going into these mines and into these oil fields. And so these intelligence agents, it was revealed in released documents in the past couple of weeks that the CSIS, the Canadian version of the FBI or CIA, is now labeling Indigenous and environmental activists terrorists. So we see this Orwellian discourse of the war on terror being deployed to criminalize protest. Now in Quebec, they passed laws because the students, 250,000 students came to the streets to protest tuition changes over the past 12 months. And now they've enacted these, what I would say are unconstitutional laws, saying that when you have a protest, you have to inform the authorities as to where your protest is going and what time it will be starting. So you can't actually have a spontaneous protest now. So we see the police state crystallizing in this country, unfortunately, but we also see some pushback. So it would be good if the same happened in the United States. One thing I thought was really great and has been really great and continues to be great about the 9/11 Truth Movement is that it's so bipartisan and so eclectic and so diverse with people coming from all kinds of ideological backgrounds and political stripes. And I think that's something that was really, really great about the 9/11 Truth Movement, that basically there's any human being who looks at Building 7, for example, the collapse of the 47-story skyscraper that collapsed in 6.5 seconds on 9/11 that wasn't hit by a plane. I think any human being that's fair-minded that looks at that can deduce that was obviously a false flag incident, a controlled demolition. That's the smoking gun of 9/11. And so I've really enjoyed the fact that in the 9/11 Truth Movement, it's not very ideological, that most people, you can have someone like Split in the Sky sort of rubbing shoulders with these kind of quite well-to-do professors who've not often been to protests. Some quite establishment people have been linking arms with the likes of Split in the Sky, who are used to resisting in the front lines. And I think that has been a very interesting sort of vehicle for pushing forward our anti-war and anti-imperialist and pro-truth and justice causes. And I'm glad that the 9/11 Truth Movement has been able to be like that.
It's pursuit of the truth. It's pursuit of the truth. It's that simple, and that should apply to everybody. I don't know if Tom had anything other to ask or say. Tom, are you still with us?
Yes, I am, and I just wanted to, out of respect for Splitting the Sky, and I just wanted to raise the question of the continued struggle for change and get your guys' perspective on that. And I appreciate everything each of you said. So I'm going to go, but I'll continue listening, and thank you again for your show.
Thanks for tuning in, Tom, and thanks for calling. And yes, and really, it's in the opening to our show, Larry, the opening audio where the mix is with Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech, along with Gil Scott-Heron. Yeah, and one of the lines in it is, nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Do something. Just do something. Talk to somebody. Hand out a flyer. Hand out a DVD. Just have the conversation. Do something. And it's another, it's another pencil hole in the dam, as they say. But do something. We're getting back to that million people on the mall, or the local people here that say, hey, I agree with what you're doing, but there's only a few of you. I'd join you if you had 100, Well, the answer is, how are we going to get to 100 if you're not one of them? Do something. But Dave, do we have any other callers in the queue?
No, but we've had someone in the chat room who'd like to join in, but she wants to talk about disclosing the money trail.
Oh, very good.
It's okay if you guys go over your 2 hours.
Oh, we hit the 2 hours?
No, he said it's okay if we go over it. Phil, I think that was something that our guest, Joshua, wanted to address. Right, Joshua?
Yes,
I just wanted to say that film that's very popular, and we included in our DVD questioning the U.S. War on Terror, is Splitting the Sky's fabulous talk, Splitting the Sky 9/11 Follow the Money, and it's available on YouTube and Google Video, and it's had hundreds of thousands of views. And he names names, he follows the money, and I think that's a good place for folks to start. But go ahead, Joshua.
Yes. Well, one thing that was good about Splitting the Sky, because he was from the New York area, he's born in New York State in Buffalo. He sort of knew that area when he was talking about the kind of geography of where the towers were, who owned the towers, the New York Port Authority. Like, he sort of really knew the architecture, and he used to say how the Mohawks had built the Twin Towers, right? Because they are fearless for heights.
Yes.
And so one interesting thing with Splitting the Sky was he was there the day before 9/11, and he knew the architecture and the geography and the location. But that's just an addendum. But, going into gatekeeping earlier, we were discussing, and although I just praised the 9/11 Truth Movement, there certainly was a faction of those in the 9/11 Truth Movement, especially kind of professors and those who are, in the intellectual classes, should we say, who have paid jobs and who maybe don't want to stick their necks out too far. There was a faction in the 9/11 Truth Movement that said, we can't get into who did 9/11. We should just focus on refuting the official story of 9/11. We should just focus on persuading politicians, persuading journalists that there's major problems with the official story of 9/11. And I think that was okay in the first year or couple of years after 9/11, just trying to slowly plod through the different anomalies that were inherent to the official story of 9/11. But after a while, it did become incumbent upon citizens to say, look, the government's not going to investigate it. We can scream out, we want a new investigation into 9/11. We can scream out, we want our media to stop dismissing 9/11 skeptics as conspiracy theorists. But that's not actually going to happen. If we're being honest, the government is never going to investigate it, because why would they incriminate themselves, right? And so I think that what Splitting the Sky did with his pursuit of following the money was he kind of broke through that gatekeeping that did exist in the 9/11 Truth Movement of people being reluctant. And I'm sure there must have been agents involved in this and infiltrators, contriving to make this the case. people who were saying, oh, we can't get into who actually did 9/11. If it wasn't 19 Arabs with box cutters, then who did do it? There was an attempt to stop people asking those questions. And I think what Splitting the Sky did, with this combination he had of a kind of lawyer's mind, because he'd spent so much time in the legal system with lawyers and hanging out with sophisticated people like William Kunstler and Ramsey Clark. He had this lawyer's mind and this ability to be precise, along with the passion and the combative personality. And so I think Splitting the Sky wasn't someone who could be silenced. And so I am appreciative that he did not just stay in the box of saying, oh, we're just going to talk about Building 7 and why the official story is false, but rather he broke through with an analysis, a grand narrative of what actually happened on 9/11 and basically who did it. I mean, if we're going to get into the crime of 9/11, surely someone's murdered. Ultimately, the job of the police officer is to arrest the person who murdered the victim, right? And likewise on 9/11, I think Splitting the Sky didn't like the way some people tried to intellectualize 9/11 and make it like something for academic debate, rather than him trying to see criminalization of those criminals, those genuine criminals in the elite, just as he had been unjustly criminalized earlier in his life. So he really wanted to see the criminalization of these people who did the 9/11 operation. And I myself also, I think, antagonized some people in the 9/11 truth movement when I followed in his footsteps of trying to get into, well, look, yeah, it's nice to talk to endlessly, for example, like architects and engineers for 9/11 truth. Like, I've spent time with Richard Gage. I like Richard Gage, but there is a quite insular approach to 9/11 skepticism with their methodology of just talking about the architecture and the science. And I think that I also had similar frustrations that Splitting the Sky displayed when people just tried to detach themselves from the kind of whodunit questions. And so I was definitely grateful. So I won't get into, it's hard for me to go into each and every person that Splitting the Sky named. I remember there was sometimes he named someone and I might disagree with him on this or that point. But generally that approach of getting into who is Brzezinski, who is Hank Greenberg, who is Larry Silverstein, who is Paul Wolfowitz, what is the Wolfowitz doctrine? These questions, at the time when Splitting the Sky started going down that path, others hadn't gone there. And that's why I personally am indebted to him for having the bravery and courage to perhaps alienate and estrange some people in the truth movement even, when he decided to get into, the who, what, when and where, rather than just the basic scientific anomalies with the official story.
But the job is still not done. The job is unfinished.
Yes, that's true, yes. Although I think,
we've got to continue this pursuit.
Yes, I think
the gift of 9/11 continues to give. Go ahead, Larry.
I think that's what Joshua was saying.
Yes.
I mean, I think he's merely laying a foundation. Yes, we do have to continue it, but we have a foundation already, and we need to utilize that foundation. And Splitting the Sky, Russell Means even, by the way. And I'm naming deliberately people, quote unquote, of color. Cynthia McKinney, who, Cynthia was kicked out of the Democratic Party for having the unmitigated audacity to question the lies and the distortions and the obfuscation, if you will, of the U.S. government as it relates not only to 9/11, but as it relates to their foreign policy and, for that matter, internal policies in this country. My point is simply this, that you are absolutely correct, Phil. We do have to continue. I use the word intensify. We have to continue and intensify. But we have a strong foundation. And people like Splitting the Sky, and I'm going to go back quickly to Splitting the Sky, because that is, after all, what this program tonight is about, in tribute to this wonderful brother comrade. Splitting the Sky did that. And one of the things, and I know this is going to infuriate the left, or the so-called left in the U.S., but so be it. The leadership of the so-called left in the United States, most of the leadership of the so-called left in the United States are nothing more than deep cover racists. I'm going to repeat that. They are nothing more than deep cover racists because they will not deal with the holistic nature of the people's struggle. They will not deal with the real aspects of imperialism. Oh, yes, they'll use the word imperialist. Oh, yes, they'll use, all of the little leftist phrases. But when it comes right down to it, particularly when people of color put their everything on the line, as did Splitting the Sky, as did Cynthia McKinney, as did Russell Means, for that matter, as did myself and other people of color, we are what? Marginalized, just like the Democrat and Republican parties do us. And the so-called leadership, the leadership of the so-called left does precisely the same thing, and they are nothing more than deep cover racists and imperialists themselves. Having said that, I will keep quiet.
Hey, thank you, Larry.
I agree with you on on what you just said. I mean, I think one observation I've made is that the presence of Israel as a force and an influence in the United States, it corrupts everything, because on the left and the right, but especially on the left, you have a lot of liberal Jewish individuals who I think in recent years have realized that anti-colonialism and anti-imperialist discourse is bad for Israel. And I think a lot of the gatekeeping, a good example is Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, right? On the surface, it seems really progressive, but, there's an obvious kind of, Zionist, impulse, implicit to that news coverage. And so I think one of the things that has changed is that whereas, say, 50 years ago, the struggles of Jewish people against genuine racism was the same struggle that African Americans and other ethnic groups were engaged in, I think in 2012, 2013, today, the struggle, the fact is that many Jewish intellectuals, are partisan to Israel, and that's encouraging them to make a kind of exclusivist, policy, an ethnically exclusivist, and also a rejection of the anti-colonialism that was once embraced by so many Jewish intellectuals. Now, there are still people like Norman Finkelstein and others who do embrace anti-colonialism, but I do think that we have to be aware of how Zionism is enveloping discourse in the United States so pervasively. And of course, this gets back to the fact, with 9/11, that 9/11 truth is bad for Israel and bad for Zionists, I'm sorry to say. And that perhaps isn't a coincidence that we have Amy Goodman constantly not inviting people like Splitting the Sky on her shows, not inviting 9/11 truthers on their shows, because 9/11 is bad for Israel, and Zionists don't like what they call conspiracy theories, even if those conspiracy theories happen to be true.
And the fact that you are absolutely correct, Joshua. You have hit the nail on the head. Amy Goodman, Democracy Now! And the fact, all we have to do, or what we need to do, is open up our critically thinking minds. The reality is that, we have to understand that we have an obligation to follow the truth. Just like we follow the money trail, we need to follow the truth trail, wherever it takes us. And I could not agree with you more, my brother, my comrade. You have hit the nail on the head.
As opposed to following these so-called leaders, follow our own gut, our own sense of right and wrong. We've got to take back our own power, our own identities. I really believe we've been programmed to look to people that are put in front of us. The talking heads, the Chris Hedges, the Amy Goodmans, the Noam Chomskys. And it's happening. I see it happening. But I thought I might have heard something in the background. Dave, did we have another caller? Yes?
Maybe he's working on it.
No, it's from area code 306. Your name and your city you're calling from, please.
Kathy, and I'm calling from Port Orange, Florida.
Oh, we know that voice.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Kathy.
Hey, Kathy.
Hi, Bill and Larry and Josh. Josh.
Hello.
Yes, and this is Kathy Bracewell, who's here, the coordinator of Code Pink of East Central Florida, and which Kathy put together in 2005. She and I have worked together. Well, she's my significant other as well, so we work together on a lot of things.
That's right.
And Kathy had a number of conversations, personal conversations with Splitting the Sky, so I'm sure she would like to share something tonight. Go ahead, Kathy.
Well, I just wanted to share, first of all, I just wanted to thank you, Phil, and Larry for having the show once again, and Dave for allowing the show to be on the network, the Wolf Radio, but thanks to Joshua also, and I was so happy to hear that he was a college student and got to know Splitting the Sky from Splitting the Sky, visiting his college class, and I was picturing the whole thing, and I could just only imagine how wonderful it was to have a real-life person in the classroom that could talk about real-life experiences, all the different things he lived through, and I also want, I'm getting kind of tired here, but I really enjoyed the show and all the information that was given. Splitting the Sky will always be very precious to me. I got to know him because of Phil, who gave me his phone number, and Phil knows that I have always, the Native American cause has always been very dear to my heart since I lived in Wisconsin and would see the people as we would drive up to our cabin in the North Woods. When I was little, I would see these people living in the woods on the sides of the roads up there in their shacks, and it was winter, and I felt really bad for them. And my dad would say, "This is how it is for the tribes up this way, Kathy." And I would cry. I felt so bad for them. And then as I grew older, I studied part of their the things they went through in American history, the beginnings of the country to the Civil War, and I had a wonderful professor at the University of Wisconsin who wrote the book Who's the Savage, and talked about the savagery of the white man towards the Native Americans. And of course, once again, I was stirred up. I've always been interested in that cause. I mean, it's dear to my heart. So when Phil told me about Splitting the Sky, gave me his number, I did call him, and I have to tell you, he was very down to earth. It was like I was talking to somebody I had known for a long time. I knew he was a warrior for truth and justice, but when I talked to him, I talked to a person who was a soccer dad. He was at his daughter's soccer game, or his son's, I can't quite remember, but he was at one of his children's soccer games, and he was just wonderful to talk to, and I told him all about my interest in the Native American cause and about my activism. And what he did was he gave me courage and inspiration to go on, just from the few talks I had with him. So I guess I'm calling, even though I'm really tired tonight. I wanted to say he will be missed. He is one of those brave warriors for truth and justice. I personally will very much miss him, just knowing that he's no longer on the planet. But he leaves behind a legacy for us, like Larry talks about and Phil talks about, and gives us the courage and inspiration to go on. And honestly, I will always miss him. I thank you so much, Josh, for telling about your history with him and your friendship with him in the classroom and outside of the classroom. I think that is so cool. And I guess that's about all I had to say.
Thank you, Kathy. And
you are welcome.
And
Thanks, Kathy.
We can have Splitting the Sky live on because of this technology, the internet, the videos, the DVDs, and he's done. There are quite a number of videos that have captured his talks, and there's still a lot of people that have yet to see these videos. So, that's something we can do while waiting for 1 million people to sit on the mall in Washington, until we get to that million people.
Bill, not while waiting for 1 million people, while organizing 1 million people, while educating and agitating 1 million people, because we know why. But go ahead.
Tongue in
Sorry,
cheek. I was tongue in cheek there, meaning that, folks that have this mindset that, when you get to 1 million, give me a call. That's what I was getting at. This is something we can do. Splitting the Sky left a great body of work that needs to be introduced to many more people until we get that critical mass. So I suggest that folks get on the YouTubes and the Google video searches, and one of the best presentations captured was that one called 9/11 Follow the Money, Splitting the Sky.
Follow the Money, and he talks in a matter-of-fact way and gives a historical approach to how the money was spent, and he goes blow by blow with it, and it's very easy to understand.
And he names names.
And it makes so much sense. It's very much common sense. Yeah. And you look at, Joshua mentioned earlier, how the politicians and the police are the ones who are supposed to be holding criminals accountable, but in fact they protect them. Well, I go back to the We Are Change motto, and they're a great example. You want peace? Demand justice. You want justice? Demand the truth. You want the truth? Ask questions and demand answers. And if you want to get involved with a great group of people that put principle before any agenda, loyalty to agendas or parties or whatever, it's We Are Change. If you go to wearechange.org, you can find a chapter close to you, and what they do is they confront these people. They because of people like splitting the Sky, who named these different people, Larry Silverstein, all that. They actually go up and confront them and ask the question, and they had put it on that video.
The We Are Change model is definitely a good one of the confrontational approach of confronting with the cameras, because, it used to be the case that media equipment wasn't affordable for ordinary working class people, but now it is. And so we can go to these events and challenge and ask the questions that the mainstream media are unwilling to ask. And in that way we can be subversive and challenge the liars and propagandists in power.
Take our own power and identity back.
I'm going to, I suspect we all are going to sign off, but I want to say this to the audience, to everyone who has spent the time to listen to this program. First, I want to thank our guests. Joshua, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It was my privilege. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you,
it was
Joshua.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I want to thank our audience, as always, our listening audience. And Dave, we love you, we respect you, and you are an integral part of the struggle. Thank you, Dave Corso. Thank you for being who and what you are. I want to end by saying two things. One, I want to quote the words of Frantz Fanon. Fanon said, "What matters is not to know the world, but to change it." What matters is not to know the world, but to change it. All power to the people. Thank you.
I cannot be silent.
Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Everyone must play a part. Everyone got to go to work. Work for peace. Spirit say work.
I cannot be silent.